And then they would lick it some more, and just that sensation, they thirsted for that, and feverishly they would lick and lick that blade. So great became their craving for blood that they didn't even notice the razor-sharp sting of the naked blade on their own tongue. And they didn't recognize the instant of the insatiable thirst of being satisfied now was their own warm blood. And this carnivorous appetite just craves more until the dawn found them dead in the snow. Chuck Swindoll, in his book, David, a Man of Passion and Destiny, says, "It's been my observation over the years that the devil never tips his hand in temptation. He shows you the beauty and the ecstasy and the fun and the excitement and the stimulating adventure of stolen desire, but he never tells the heavy drinker, tomorrow there'll be a hangover. Ultimately, you'll ruin your family. He never tells the drug user early on, this is the beginning of a long, sorrowful, dead-end road. He never tells the thief, you're going to get caught, friend. You do this and you're going to wind up behind bars. He certainly doesn't warn the adulterer. You know pregnancy is a real possibility, or you could get some life-threatening disease. Are you kidding? Face it, when the sin is done and all the penalties of that sin come due, the devil is nowhere to be found. He just smiles as you fall, and he leaves you with no encouragement when the consequences kick in. So how do you clear the hurdles of temptation and lust, especially when we live among the majority of people who live with the philosophy, if it feels good, what? Especially when we live in a time when lowering moral standards seems to be applauded. When we ease the promptings of our conscience with the excuse, everybody's doing it. And when we find it easy to ignore the idea of a holy God by seeing Him as someone wanting to interrupt our fun on the playground of life, how do you clear the temptations of lust and temptations? One of the things that I have found, whether it's in the business world or even in ministry, the best ways to learn how to have success at something is to talk to somebody who's been successful. So with that in mind, as you turn to Genesis 39 this morning, we find the story of one desperate housewife and a young man that had been able to clear the hurdle of temptation and lust. Let me set the stage for you because I don't have time to read the entire chapter. It kind of set the groundwork. You have to go back a couple of chapters in chapter 37 where you find a 17-year-old boy by the name of Joseph, who was his father's favored son. Everybody knew it. His brothers knew it. They were jealous of him. His favoritism was symbolized in the fact that the father had him made this ornate robe which symbolized he was the favored son. It really wasn't a lot expected of him. He got all the easy jobs, in which made his brothers extremely jealous of him. Literally it says in chapter 37, they hated him. And if it wasn't bad enough that they were already jealous of him, Joseph has this dream. And he takes the initiative to share it with his brothers, which made them even madder. His dream had the idea that at some point, his brothers and even his mother and father are going to bow down to him. And in chapter 37, verse 8, his brothers said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule over us? And notice what it says, and they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. So one day, the brothers are off in where we know as Dothan. They're out tending their father's flocks, and they were grazing his sheep. And the father sends little Joseph off, his 17-year-old favorite son, to check on his brothers and see how things are going, if everything is going okay. And when his brothers see him coming at a distance, they're trying to figure out how we're going to get rid of this guy. They're going to kill him. They want to murder him. And in verse 19 of chapter 37 says, here comes the dreamer. I mean, everybody, we can kind of get that. We understand that sense of jealousy and unhappiness sometimes over seeing like somebody really done it easy. And they said to each other, come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him, and then we'll see what comes of his dreams. And his older brother catches wind of this, and he sets the rest of them down, and he says, guys, this really isn't such a good idea. Why don't you just throw him in the cistern? You know, anybody that's ever been around, you know, have older brothers and how they treat you and that kind of stuff. But they said, throw him in the cistern, and when I get back, I'll take him back home to Dad. Don't do anything stupid. So when Joseph gets him, they take his robe from him and they throw him in the cistern. But they sat down to eat lunch. And there comes this caravan of merchants on their way to Egypt. And guess what? They sell their brother to these guys for the price of just an everyday, ordinary slave. I wonder what they did with the money. 17-year-old brother who is now the victim of his brother's anger and rage finds himself being separated from his father that loved him, his family, his country, and he's on his way to Egypt. And his brothers come up with this ridiculous story that now they're going to have to go back and tell their father about his favorite son, and how they have to dip some animal blood on it and make up this crazy story about how a ferocious animal devoured him. And when they tell him this story, it says that his dad runs for days. Verse 36 of chapter 37 says, the Midianites, as they make their way to Egypt, when they get there, they sell him to a guy by the name of Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Probably somewhere around 300 miles away from home, Joseph finds himself in a country and a culture that he didn't know anything about, surrounded by people that spoke a language that he didn't understand. He is now the property. He is the slave of one of Pharaoh's officials. He's the property of Pharaoh, who's the captain of the guard. What does that mean? Jewish historians describe this elite, courageous band of rugged men as executioners. So Pharaoh was the head, or Potiphar was the head of Pharaoh's executioners. So obviously he'd be somebody that you wouldn't want to mess with. But there's one phrase that I encourage you to go back and read this story. I don't have time to cover the whole story that takes you through the end of the book of Genesis. But there's a phrase that continues to move all through the story of Joseph's life. And it's this phrase. And the Lord was with Joseph. It is one of my favorite, all-time favorite stories in the Bible. So we pick up in chapter 39, verse 3. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, Joseph's one of those pictures of what we're commanded to be in the Sermon on the Mount, the salt of the earth and the light of the world. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Obviously, Joseph was a man of integrity. He had great character. Potiphar put him in charge of his household and entrusted to his care everything he owned. And from that time, he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned. And the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So he left in Joseph's care everything he had with Joseph in charge. I want you to notice what this says. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. When you think about it, Joseph's rise to influence in Potiphar's house was a result not only of God's favor, but of Joseph's integrity. Potiphar experienced God's blessing on his household because of the character of Joseph. But when it says that with Joseph in charge of everything, the only thing that Potiphar had to worry about was he could trust him with everything. The only thing he had to worry about was, what am I going to eat?